Ricoeur refers to the biblical imperative, love thy neighbor, in his discussion of the modern world's relation to this message from the Gospels. He claims that this imperative, emphasizing the importance of the neighbor as it does, has disappeared and become abstracted into social institutions of various kinds, factories, military camps, prisons, concentration camps, etc., page 102. The idea of a neighbor as a consequence becomes marginalized, becoming a dream that we can awaken from once this world of ours falls into the state of ruin and destruction predicted by the Delphic oracle. Ricoeur also uses the dramatic analogy of committing suicide in this discussion. It is interesting to note, however, that central constitutive cultural institutions such as schools, universities, and lawmaking governments are regarded as repressive of positive social relations insofar as they trade in the traditional currency of rationality, rather than the cryptocurrency of the power of the imagination. The image of society we are invited to form is that of a flawed creation heading for ruin and destruction. Ricoeur calls social man socius, and connects him to the man of history, a man for whom the love thy neighbor message has been marginalized and who consequently does not cohabit well with his neighbor. This historical social being is a man of regret, dream, and myth, living in a state of chaos and needing the understanding of a friend, given the absence of oracles and perhaps even God. Suffering is a natural consequence of chaos, and the neighbor is witness to this suffering. The neighbor stands outside the work context and is therefore untouched by Marxism and its conception of the specialized work process. The question to ask is whether charity is an abstraction in such a context, seemingly belonging to the private space of dwelling. For Ricoeur, evil resides in the objectification of social institutions and their divisiveness. It is further maintained that all forms of progressivism fail to understand such evil. Institutions of justice, in particular, Ricoeur argues, manifest a foreign and cancerous passion, the passion of an abstract administration. Page 106. This kind of description of institutions of justice is, to say the very least, contentious, and implies that there is a heart of corruption present in our organic communities. Ricoeur is here relying on the fact that periodic observations of such institutions may reveal such corruption, and that this then suffices for their universal condemnation. Institutions of justice, however, are best defined by their telos or purpose, which is to make just judgments and deliver just processes in a democratic environment of transparency and accountability. Individual instances of corruption ought not to permit universal generalizations relating to the state of the whole institution, its history and future. Power relations, whether they be technocratic, ecclesiastic, political, or military, are oligarchic rather than democratic. Such relations do not, Ricoeur argues, manifest those virtuous intentions which strive for the good of the individual and the community. Kant would, of course, argue that this is their purpose or telos, and what they ought to do, but Ricoeur does not, as we have seen, accept this form of ethical reasoning in the mode of the prescriptive. The categorical imperative of treating people as ends in themselves via the law, so act that you can will that the maxim of your action become a universal law, is a problematic abstraction for Ricoeur. This form of reasoning is, of course, one of the foundation stones of democracy and requires considerable philosophical argumentation to defend. Argumentation which must invoke the practical rational ideas of freedom, justice, and equality in the justification of duties and human rights. Periodic observations of the activities of our institutions can, of course, be the ground for making negative judgments about these activities, especially if these observations concern the corruption of the purpose or telos of these institutions. But the only way to measure the moral quality of these activities is via the above practical rational ideas which are situated logically and conceptually in the prescriptive ought system of judgments. The relation of man to his institutions, on the Kantian view, is organic, and this contrasts with the accusation of Ricoeur that our social forms of existence are artificial. This is not to deny that negative judgments can periodically be true, especially when the focus is reversed from treating people as ends in themselves, phronesis, to treating them as a means to some bureaucratic institutional end, techne. Ricoeur's solution to the problem of the alienated subjugated citizen in a chaotic society is the initiation of charitable activity in relation to one's neighbor, which as a matter of fact ought to be our natural instinctive response to the difficult task of living in a difficult, sometimes dangerous world. Ricoeur's reduction of the abstract ethical aspect of social activity to the more concrete descriptive level indicated in the message "Love thy neighbor" fails to acknowledge the need for abstract judgments such as "promises ought to be kept," as families grow organically into villages, which in their turn organically grow into cities. Periodic observations record the disappointing facts that promises are made at institutional levels and then not, for different reasons, actualized. If the reason for the failure to keep one's promise is related to dishonesty and promises were made solely for the purpose of acquiring power, then this is clearly a case of treating people as means to an end. And the only rational response to such a state of affairs is not to abandon the imperative that promises ought to be kept, or indeed the goal of treating people as ends in themselves. The goal in such circumstances, rather, ought to be to judge this corruption in the light of the categorical imperative. Charitable acts towards one's neighbor and the keeping of promises are both categorical imperatives which actualize the intention of treating people as ends in themselves. Both imperatives may be regarded as objectifications, but regarding objectifications as evil merely on account of their abstraction requires further argumentation which Ricoeur does not provide in this work. Ricoeur notes the failure of the Greek city-states to survive as independent political entities, and the subsequent political need for larger entities such as nation-states. This organic development itself resulted in a need for international regulation of the kind envisaged by Kant, a United Nations regulating human rights. In such transformations, institutions are created which in turn need regulation by their communities if lapses from the central purpose, injustices, is not to lead such communities down the path toward ruin and destruction. In such circumstances it may be true to say, as Ricoeur does, that charity may be nothing more than an alibi for justice, page 108. This sets up a dialectical opposition between socius, the historical man, and the neighbor which, of course, is a part of the argumentation that is supposed to establish the truth of the claim that existence is fundamentally ambiguous. In this realm of ambiguity, it is the power of the imagination, and not reason or categorical understanding, that reigns, Ricoeur argues. In such a realm, discourse fixates upon images, and one effect of this can be seen in the essay entitled "The Image of God and the Epic of Man," page 110. Ricoeur is, of course, aware of the limitations of conceptualizing the image as an imprint, and attempts to add an active dimension to this power by claiming that the image of God, for example, can be interpreted as the power of human creativity, thereby transferring the debate into the arena of the will and the power of thought. This creativity, Ricoeur argues, occurs in the midst of the chaos of evil which challenges our faith in the grace of God to save us. On the Christian account, Ricoeur points out, Jesus Christ is the rebirth of creation, and the image of God is thereby given human form which enables a more concrete link to be made to the epical life of man. Our humanity is broken, Ricoeur insists on page 113. This is the case because of the fundamental conflict between the private zones of the workings of individual consciousness when engaged in charitable acts towards one's neighbor, and the public zones of activity in economic, political, and social life. Both zones are mad, Ricoeur claims, when related to the sane forms of moderation of our lives by meditation upon the image of God. In his further reflections upon this issue, Ricoeur turns to a consideration of the role of language and invokes the biblical meaning of logos, which it is claimed is the name for God the Creator. Creation is thus bound up somehow with language, but it is not clear exactly how, page 113. Instead, Ricoeur moves on to attempt to navigate a philosophical course between what he calls the dichotomy of the personal and the anonymous. Surprisingly, he turns to Kant's work on anthropology for an account of the spheres of influence that affect the reality and history of man. These spheres of possession, power, and value are situated respectively in the economic, political, and cultural arenas of the activities of man. Ricoeur does not make this point, but we should recall in the context of this discussion that Kant makes a clear distinction between that which assists in the processes of the civilizing of man, possession, power, and that which constitutes his cultural being, e.g., that which makes him a worthy man and citizen of his society. Naturally, there is a complex relation between these arenas of activity, but, on the Kantian view, it is the activity in the cultural arena that ought to regulate activity in the economic and political arenas. Ethical reasoning becomes the primary regulator of all significant human activity. This is similar to the Aristotelian account of ethical virtue in which arete and arche play important roles in all spheres of influence, e.g. doing the right thing in the right way at the singular right time in accordance with appropriate prescriptive principles. Ricoeur argues that these spheres of influence help to avoid the dialectical confrontation that would otherwise occur between the private and public zones of activity referred to above. Ricoeur, given his opposition to Kantian abstract ethics, wishes instead to chart the epic of the image of God, and ask how this focus can illuminate the significance of our three spheres of influence. Evil threatens the downfall of these three spheres, especially via the uses of language for lying, gossiping, flattering, and tempting. These abuses, together with the misunderstandings arising because of the scattering of various languages, suffices for Ricoeur to maintain his skeptical stance toward the one singular message of Kant's anthropology, namely, that all is well in these spheres so long as ethical principles and laws regulate activity in them. Ricoeur praises Marx for not being a moralist, page 115, and also praises Marx's concept of alienation. Capital, Ricoeur claims, in agreement with Marx, entails a certain destruction of humanity, page 115, dehumanizing man and turning him into a possession, a slave. In a world dominated by capital, it is argued, speech and thought become fetishes. Power, Ricoeur argues, is hierarchical in its essence and promotes inequality between men, and it is this phenomenon that history most concerns itself with. In the Bible, Ricoeur points out, we encounter the complaints of the prophets made against the mighty and powerful kings. Many of these kings were tyrants who had in various ways enslaved their people and turned them into cowards. This passion for power, historians have noted, so often ends in madness and death. Ricoeur wishes to use theological anthropology to pick up the scattered pieces of man, whether it be those that have been alienated or violently subjugated. Hegel is invoked via the idea of the struggle for recognition of the slave against his master, and situated in a culture that provides images of man via works, monuments and objects. For Hegel this process was fundamentally historical, but for Ricoeur it is theological anthropology, and the striving after the grace of God that will help save man from himself and the evil that surrounds him. Such a vision assumes an authority that is created by God, and it is admitted that, in spite of their violent nature, empires have been influential in advancing law, knowledge, culture, the well-being of man and the arts. Mankind has not only survived, it has grown, it has survived and become more mature, more adult. Page 121. This, of course, is roughly the vision of Kant, but there is in Kant's anthropology less of an appeal to the image of God, and more of an appeal to man's nature as expressed in the formula, rational animal capable of discourse. Kantian man believes in God as a guarantor of the summum bonum of a good-spirited, flourishing life. Kantian man is also to a greater extent a political being, paying more attention to the practically rational idea of freedom than the theoretically rational idea of God. For Kant, evil is wrought by the unsocial sociability of man, which so often results in antagonism toward his fellows, and it is the failure to regulate this antagonism that generates evil. Regulatory mechanisms include discourse and the rational ideas of freedom, justice and equality that permeates the declared intentions of our institutions. On page 125, Ricoeur partially acknowledges the gravitas of the Kantian account by acknowledging the importance of the construction of the city that will function in his account as a sign of the kingdom of the Imago Dei. This acknowledgement apart, there is very little similarity in these two accounts given the central place of the power of the imagination in Ricoeur's anthropology. For Ricoeur, it is redemption and salvation that is the theological telos of the kingdoms of the future. The role of sound judgment and sound reasoning in this vision is not clear. Neither is it clear how freedom and responsibility could possibly be justified in terms of a power of the imagination.